Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock above the kitchen pass. 9:30 on a Friday night meant the restaurant was hitting its peak rush. The small Italian place where she worked as a server had been her lifeline for the past 2 years, ever since her husband deployed overseas with the Navy. The dining room buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. Sarah balanced 3 plates on her left arm while carrying a wine bottle in her right hand. She had perfected this technique through countless shifts, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make every step count. At table 7, a group of 4 men in expensive suits sat nursing their second bottle of wine. They had been there for over an hour, and Sarah had noticed their voices getting louder with each glass. The restaurant's dim lighting cast shadows across their faces, but she could see their eyes following her every time she passed their table. "Excuse me, sweetheart," one of them called out as she walked by carrying dirty plates. His voice carried that particular tone she had learned to recognize over her years in the service industry. The kind that made her stomach tighten with unease. Sarah stopped and turned toward their table with her professional smile firmly in place. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" The man who had spoken was in his 40s, with perfectly styled gray hair and a watch that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. His 3 companions looked similar, well-dressed, confident, and clearly used to getting their way. "We were wondering if you'd like to join us for a drink when you get off work," he said, his words slightly slurred. "We're staying at the Marriott downtown. Very nice place. Very private." Sarah's smile didn't waver, though her grip tightened on the plates she carried. "Thank you for the invitation, but I'll have to decline. Can I get you anything else for your dinner?" "Come on, don't be like that," another man chimed in. He had a thick Boston accent and a red face that spoke of too much alcohol. "We're just being friendly. When's the last time someone showed you a good time?" The comment hit Sarah like a slap. She thought of the empty apartment waiting for her at home, of the video calls with her husband that never seemed long enough, of the constant worry about his safety that kept her awake most nights. "I'm married, gentlemen. My husband is serving overseas. Now, is there anything else I can get for your table?" The third man, younger than the others with slicked back dark hair, laughed. "Overseas, huh? Bet he's not coming back anytime soon. Or maybe not at all. You shouldn't have to wait around for someone who might not make it home." The words cut deep, touching on Sarah's worst fears. But she had learned to handle difficult customers, and she wasn't about to let these men see how much their comments affected her. "I'll give you a few more minutes to decide on dessert," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. As she turned to leave, the first man reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Hey, we're talking to you. Don't walk away from us." Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back at his face. "Please let go of me, sir." "Or what?" he said, his grip tightening. "You'll call your husband?" "Oh wait, he's not here, is he?" The restaurant continued buzzing around them, but Sarah felt like she was in a bubble of tension. Other customers were starting to notice the commotion. She could see her manager, Tony, looking their way with concern. "I'm going to ask you one more time to let go of my wrist," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. The man's 3 friends were laughing now, enjoying the show. One of them pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is great," he said. "Little waitress thinks she's tough." At that moment, a voice cut through the noise from the table directly behind them. "I think the lady asked you to let go." Everyone at table 7 turned to look at the speaker. He was a man in his 30s, sitting alone at a small corner table. He wore a simple black button-down shirt and jeans. His dark hair was cut short, and his posture was relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The man holding Sarah's wrist looked annoyed at the interruption. "Mind your own business, friend. This doesn't concern you." The stranger took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "Actually, it does concern me. See, when someone asks you to let them go and you don't, that becomes everyone's concern." "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" the Boston accent man said, standing up from his chair. He was a big guy, probably 6'2" and heavy-set. The stranger remained seated, but Sarah noticed his body language had changed. There was a coiled energy about him now, like a spring wound tight. "I'm going to ask nicely for you to let the lady go and apologize for your behavior." The four men burst into laughter. "You're going to ask nicely," the younger one said. "That's rich." "Do you know who we are?" "Can't say that I do," the stranger replied. "But I know what you are." The gray-haired man finally released Sarah's wrist and stood up. "We're executives with Hartman Industries. We have more money than you'll see in your lifetime. So why don't you sit down, finish your coffee, and mind your own business before we have you thrown out of here?" Sarah rubbed her wrist where red marks were already forming. She wanted to thank the stranger for intervening, but she also didn't want to escalate the situation further. Tony was making his way over now, his face creased with worry. "Everything okay over here?" Tony asked, though his eyes took in the scene and it was clear he understood the situation. "Everything's fine," the gray-haired man said smoothly. "Just having a conversation with your charming waitress here. Though I think your establishment could use better training on customer service." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. She had done nothing wrong, but somehow these men were making her feel like she had. The stranger finally stood up from his table, and Sarah was surprised by his height. He wasn't as big as the Boston man, but there was something about the way he moved that commanded attention. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it on his table. "Tony, is it?" he said to the manager. "You might want to call the police. These gentlemen have assaulted one of your employees." "Assaulted?" the younger man scoffed. "We barely touched her." "And who are you, her boyfriend? Her knight in shining armor?" The stranger walked over to their table, moving with a quiet confidence that made the room feel smaller. "No, I'm just someone who was raised to respect women. Something your parents apparently forgot to teach you." The Boston man stepped closer to the stranger, trying to use his size to intimidate him. "You better watch your mouth, pal. We could buy and sell you 10 times over." "Money doesn't buy character," the stranger replied calmly. "And it doesn't give you the right to put your hands on someone without permission." Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The stranger was standing up for her, but she didn't want him to get hurt because of her problems. "Listen," she said, stepping between them. "Thank you for your concern, but I can handle this." "Why don't you just know?" the stranger said firmly, but kindly. "You shouldn't have to handle this alone." The gray-haired man had heard enough. "Okay, hero, you want to play White Knight? Let's see how tough you are." He swung his fist toward the stranger's face, but what happened next was so fast that Sarah almost missed it. The stranger moved slightly to the right, caught the man's wrist, and, in one smooth motion, had him face down on the table with his arm twisted behind his back. The other three men stood in shock for a moment before the Boston man charged forward. The stranger released the gray-haired man and stepped aside, using the charging man's momentum against him. The Boston man stumbled into an empty chair and crashed to the floor. The younger man pulled out his phone again, but this time he seemed to be calling someone rather than recording. "We're calling the cops," he said. "You just assaulted 4 businessmen." The stranger smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Please do call them. I'd be happy to explain to the officers how these 4 businessmen grabbed a waitress and refused to let go when she asked them to stop." Tony had been watching the entire scene with wide eyes. I've already called the police," he said. "They should be here any minute." The fourth man, who had been quiet throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We have connections. We can make your life very difficult." The stranger straightened his shirt and walked back to his table to pick up his jacket. "I'm not worried about that." "You should be," the gray-haired man said, rubbing his shoulder where it had been twisted. "We'll sue you for assault. We'll make sure you never work in this city again." As if on cue, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching the restaurant. The stranger looked at Sarah, who was still standing near table 7, trying to process everything that had just happened. "Are you okay?" he asked her. Sarah nodded, though her hands were still shaking slightly. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply. The police officers entered the restaurant, and Tony rushed to greet them. The gray-haired man immediately began talking to one of the officers, gesturing dramatically and pointing at the stranger. Sarah watched as the officer listened politely but seemed unimpressed by the man's story. When the officer walked over to talk to her, she told him exactly what had happened, how the men had grabbed her wrist and refused to let go despite her asking them to stop. The stranger stood quietly to the side, waiting his turn to give his statement. There was something about his calm demeanor that struck Sarah as unusual. Most people would be nervous talking to the police after a physical altercation, but he seemed completely at ease. When the officer finally approached him, the stranger reached into his wallet and pulled out what looked like an ID card. He handed it to the officer without saying a word. The officer's entire demeanor changed when he looked at the card. He straightened up and handed it back with obvious respect. "Thank you for your service, sir. I'll need to get your statement, but it's clear what happened here." Sarah couldn't hear the conversation between the stranger and the officer, but she noticed the four businessmen were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Whatever was on that ID card had shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. 20 minutes later, the four men were escorted out of the restaurant. The officer in charge came over to speak with Sarah. "Ma'am, those men have been charged with assault. We have multiple witnesses who saw them grab you, and the security cameras caught everything. You'll need to come to the station tomorrow to file a formal complaint, but don't worry, this is an open and shut case." After the police left, the restaurant slowly returned to normal. Other customers went back to their meals, though Sarah noticed several people looking at her with sympathy and respect. She walked over to where the stranger was putting on his jacket. "I never got to properly thank you," she said. "What you did, that took courage." He looked at her with those same calm eyes that had unsettled the four men so much. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Martinez." "I'm Jake. Jake Thompson." He paused for a moment, then asked, "Your husband, which branch of service?" "Navy. He's a sonar technician on a submarine. Been deployed for 6 months now." Jake nodded with understanding. "That's tough. Submarine deployments are some of the hardest on families." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah think he spoke from experience. "Are you military?" Jake smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first genuine smile she had seen from him all night. "Something like that." He headed toward the door, then turned back. "Sarah? Your husband is lucky to have someone like you waiting for him. Not every man gets to come home to someone with that kind of strength." As Jake walked out into the night, Sarah stood in the empty restaurant wondering who exactly had just changed her evening, and possibly her life. The way the police officer had reacted to his ID, the ease with which he had handled four aggressive men, and the quiet confidence he carried all suggested there was much more to Jake Thompson than met the eye. Tony came over and put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay, kiddo? That was pretty intense." Sarah looked out the window, but Jake had already disappeared into the darkness. "Yeah, Tony. I think I'm going to be just fine." She spent the rest of her shift replaying the evening's events in her mind. The way Jake had moved, the respect the police officer had shown him, and, most importantly, the way he had stepped in to help a complete stranger without expecting anything in return. As Sarah finally drove home that night, she found herself thinking about courage. She had always thought courage meant not being afraid. But, watching Jake that evening, she realized courage might actually mean being afraid and helping anyway. She had no idea that her encounter with Jake Thompson was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Jake Thompson. 3 days had passed since the incident at the restaurant, and she found herself looking for him every time she walked to work or ran errands around town. There was something about the quiet confidence he had displayed that night that stuck with her. On Tuesday afternoon, while grabbing coffee at the small cafe near her apartment, Sarah spotted a familiar figure sitting at a corner table. Jake was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee, looking completely ordinary in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then walked over to his table. "Jake? I thought that was you." He looked up from his newspaper and smiled. "Sarah. How are you holding up after Friday night?" "Better, thanks to you." She gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" "Please do." Sarah sat down and studied his face in the daylight. He looked younger than she had initially thought, probably early 30s, with kind brown eyes and laugh lines that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor from Friday night had indicated. "I wanted to properly thank you," she said. "What you did that night, most people would have just looked the other way." Jake folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Most people haven't been trained to do otherwise." "Trained?" Sarah caught the implication in his words. "You mentioned something to the police officer about service. What branch?" For a moment, Jake seemed to weigh whether to answer. Then, he said quietly, "Navy. Special operations." Sarah felt her heart skip. "Like my husband's submarine?" "Not exactly." Jake took a sip of his coffee. "Different kind of underwater work." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, her phone buzzed with a text message. Her face lit up when she saw the sender's name. "It's from David, my husband. He's getting some shore time next week. They're docking in Norfolk for maintenance." She looked up at Jake with excitement. "I haven't seen him in person for 6 months." "That's great," Jake said, and Sarah could tell he genuinely meant it. "You must be excited." "Terrified is more like it," Sarah admitted. "Is that weird?" "I mean, I love him more than anything, but these deployments, they change you. Both of you. Sometimes I worry we won't know how to be together anymore." Jake nodded with understanding. "It's not weird at all. Reintegration is one of the hardest parts of military life. For both spouses." "You sound like you know from experience." "I do." Jake's expression grew more serious. "I was married once. Military relationships are tough under the best circumstances." Sarah noticed he said was married, not am, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she asked, "Any advice for someone who's about to see her husband after 6 months apart?" "Give yourselves time," Jake said. "Don't expect everything to go back to normal right away. You've both been living separate lives for 6 months. You need time to remember how to be a team again." They talked for another 20 minutes about military life, the challenges of separation, and the small town they both found themselves living in. Jake mentioned he was transitioning out of active duty and trying to figure out what came next. "It's harder than I expected," he admitted. "In the military, especially in special operations, your identity is so tied up in what you do. When that's gone, you have to figure out who you are as a regular person." "What kind of work are you looking into?" Sarah asked. "Private security, maybe. Some of my teammates have gone into contracting work. Good money, but it means more time away from home." He paused. "Though I suppose that's less of an issue for me now." Sarah sensed there was a story behind his divorce but didn't pry. Instead, she said, "For what it's worth, I think you'd be good at whatever you choose. You have that quality, you make people feel safe." Jake looked surprised by the comment. "That's a nice thing to say." "It's true. Friday night, even before you stepped in, just knowing you were there made me feel less alone." They were interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. The caller ID showed her manager's number. "Sorry, I need to take this," she said to Jake before answering. "Hi, Tony." "Sarah, thank God you answered. I have some bad news." "Remember those guys from Friday night? Well, they filed a complaint with corporate. They're claiming you were rude and unprofessional, and they want you fired." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What?" "But they assaulted me. The police have it on record." I know, honey. I know. But these guys have money and connections. Corporate is putting pressure on me to let you go. I'm fighting it, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the world tilt around her. She had been working at the restaurant for 2 years, building up good relationships with regular customers and saving every penny she could while David was deployed. Losing this job would be devastating. Okay, she said quietly. Thanks for the warning, Tony. Don't give up yet. I'm not done fighting for you. After she hung up, Sarah realized Jake had been listening to her side of the conversation. His expression had grown hard. They're trying to get you fired, he asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. What's the name of the company these men work for? Hartman Industries, I think. Why? Jake pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Hey, Marcus. I need you to look up a company called Hartman Industries. Yeah, I'll wait. While Jake waited for his call to connect, Sarah tried to process what was happening. It wasn't fair. She had done nothing wrong, yet these men were using their money and influence to destroy her livelihood. Jake was saying into the phone. Real estate development. For executives. Yeah, that sounds right. He listened for another minute. Interesting. Thanks, Marcus. I owe you one. Jake hung up and looked at Sarah with a grim expression. Hartman Industries is a real estate development company. They specialize in luxury resorts and commercial properties. The 4 men you dealt with are senior executives, lots of money, lots of political connections. So I'm screwed, Sarah said flatly. Maybe not. Jake leaned forward across the table. Tell me everything you remember about that night. Everything they said, everything they did. Sarah recounted the evening in detail, including the men's comments about her husband, their physical grabbing of her wrist, and their threats after Jake had intervened. When she finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, Sarah, I want to help you, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? I barely know you. I know. But sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. Sarah thought about her options. She could let these men destroy her job and reputation, or she could trust the stranger who had already proven he was willing to stand up for her. What do you want me to do? First, I want you to document everything. Write down exactly what happened, with times and dates. Second, I want you to go to the police station and get a copy of the incident report from Friday night. Okay. And then, what? Then, you let me worry about the rest. Over the next 2 days, Sarah did exactly what Jake had asked. She wrote out a detailed account of Friday night's events and obtained copies of the police report. The report clearly stated that the 4 men had been charged with assault after grabbing her against her will. On Thursday morning, Sarah's phone rang. It was Tony. Sarah, you're not going to believe this, Tony said, his voice filled with amazement. Corporate just called. The complaint against you has been withdrawn. Not only that, but Hartman Industries issued a formal apology and made a significant donation to our employee assistance fund. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. What? How is that possible? I have no idea. All I know is that yesterday afternoon, someone from Hartman Industries called corporate and said there had been a misunderstanding. They said their executives had been drinking and behaved inappropriately, and they deeply regretted any trouble they had caused you. After hanging up with Tony, Sarah immediately called Jake. He answered on the second ring. Jake, I don't know what you did, but the complaint has been withdrawn. How did you manage that? I didn't do anything illegal, Jake said. I just made sure the right people saw the police report and understood the full story. Amazing how people's attitudes change when they realize their actions are a matter of public record. That's it? You just showed them the police report? Jake chuckled. Sarah, these men are executives at a major corporation. The last thing they want is a public scandal involving assault charges against employees. Once they realized how bad this could look for their company, they decided it was better to cut their losses. But, how did you even get in touch with them? I have some connections from my Navy days. Let's just say when certain people make certain phone calls, other people tend to listen. Sarah was quiet for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. Jake, who are you, really? I'm someone who believes that good people shouldn't be punished for doing nothing wrong. That afternoon, Sarah was working her usual shift when she noticed a familiar figure walk into the restaurant. Jake sat at the same corner table where the whole incident had started, and Sarah walked over to take his order. "Coffee, black," he said with a smile. "Coming right up." Sarah paused, then said quietly, "Jake, I can never repay you for what you've done. You don't owe me anything. But, I do have a favor to ask." "Anything. When your husband gets back from deployment, I'd like to meet him. Any man who has a wife like you defending his honor while he's away serving his country is someone I'd like to shake hands with." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "He'd like that. He'd like you." As Sarah walked back to get Jake's coffee, she realized that sometimes angels came in the most unexpected forms. She had gone from fearing for her job to having it secured, all because a stranger had decided to care about what happened to someone he barely knew. That evening, Sarah video called David to tell him about everything that had happened. When she finished the story, David was quiet for a long moment. "This Jake guy," David finally said. "I want to meet him when I get back. Anyone who looks out for you while I'm gone is family as far as I'm concerned." "I told him you'd say that." "Sarah?" "Yeah. I'm proud of you. For standing up to those men, for handling everything on your own. You're stronger than you know." As Sarah lay in bed that night, she thought about strength and courage again. She was beginning to understand that both came in many forms. Sometimes it was a Navy SEAL stepping in to defend a stranger. Sometimes it was a submarine sailor serving his country thousands of miles from home. And sometimes it was a waitress who refused to be intimidated by men who thought their money made them untouchable. She was also beginning to understand that some encounters change your life in ways you never expect. Meeting Jake Thompson had reminded her that there were still good people in the world, people who would risk their own safety to protect others. Tomorrow, David would start his journey home to her. And, when he arrived, she would introduce him to the man who had made sure she was still there waiting for him. The Norfolk Naval Station was buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived on Friday morning. Sailors in their dress uniforms walked purposefully across the base while families gathered near the pier, holding signs and flowers. Sarah had driven 4 hours from her hometown to be here when David's submarine docked. She spotted Jake leaning against a fence near the family waiting area. He wore a simple navy blue polo shirt and khakis, but something about his posture made him stand out among the civilian families. When he saw Sarah, he walked over with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Nervous. Excited. Terrified." Sarah clutched the small welcome home sign she had made. "Thank you for driving down here with me. I know you didn't have to." "I wanted to meet the man you've been telling me about," Jake said. "Besides, homecomings are special. Everyone should have people there cheering for them." Over the past week, Sarah and Jake had become genuine friends. They had coffee together most mornings, and Jake had helped her prepare for David's return. He had given her practical advice about readjustment period and had listened patiently when she expressed her fears about how 6 months apart might have changed their relationship. "There she is," someone called out, and Sarah looked toward the harbor to see the massive black submarine emerging from the morning fog. The USS Michigan looked like a sleeping giant rising from the depths, and Sarah felt her heart skip as she thought about David somewhere inside that metal hull. The docking process took over an hour, but Sarah barely noticed the time passing. Jake stood quietly beside her, occasionally pointing out different aspects of the submarine's design or explaining what the crew was doing as they secured the boat to the pier. Finally, the crew began disembarking. Sarah scanned the faces of the sailors walking down the gangplank, looking for the familiar features she had missed for so long. "Sarah." She heard her name and turned to see David breaking away from his shipmates and running toward her. He looked thinner than she remembered, and his hair was shorter, but his smile was exactly the same. Sarah ran toward him, and, when they collided in an embrace, she felt like she could finally breathe properly for the first time in months. David lifted her off the ground and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "God, I missed you," David whispered in her ear. "I missed you too. So much." They held each other for several minutes, oblivious to the reunions happening around them. Finally, Sarah pulled back and looked at her husband's face, memorizing every detail. "You look good," she said, though she could see the exhaustion in his eyes that came from months of irregular sleep schedules and high stress. "You look beautiful," David replied. "Better than beautiful. You look strong." Sarah remembered Jake and turned to introduce him, but he had stepped back to give them privacy. When he saw her looking his way, he walked over with a respectful distance. "David, I want you to meet someone very important," Sarah said. "This is Jake Thompson." "Jake, this is my husband David." David studied Jake for a moment, taking in his bearing and the way he carried himself. Then, he extended his hand. "Jake. Sarah told me what you did. Thank you for looking out for my wife while I was gone." Jake shook David's hand firmly. "She didn't need much looking out for. Your wife is tougher than she gives herself credit for." "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out," David said with a grin. "Sarah mentioned your Navy too?" "I was. Just finished my active duty time." David's expression grew more serious. "What was your rate?" Jake hesitated for just a moment. "Special operations." David's eyebrows went up. "SEAL?" "Yeah." The change in David's demeanor was immediate and noticeable. He straightened up slightly and his handshake became more formal. "What team?" "Team 6. Did 8 years active, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to other places I can't talk about." David whistled low. "Holy shit. Sorry, honey," he added to Sarah. "Jake, you're one of the guys we read about in the papers. The real deal." Jake looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing my job, same as you." "Not exactly the same," David said with obvious respect. "What you guys do, that's a whole different level." Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding. She had known Jake was military, but she was beginning to realize she had greatly underestimated what that meant. The way David was reacting suggested Jake wasn't just any former Navy sailor. "Can I buy you lunch?" David asked. "Both of you?" "I want to hear about how you two met, and I have some liberty time before I need to report back." They found a small restaurant near the base that catered to military families. Over burgers and fries, Sarah told David the complete story of that Friday night at the restaurant. She watched her husband's expression grow darker as she described how the 4 men had grabbed her and made threatening comments about him. When she finished, David was quiet for a long moment. Then, he looked at Jake with gratitude that went beyond words. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," David said quietly. "Those men put their hands on my wife. If you hadn't been there." "But I was there," Jake said simply. "And Sarah handled herself better than most people would have." "Still," David said. "What you did, stepping in for a stranger like that says everything about who you are." Jake seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the praise. "Your wife would have done the same thing if the situation had been reversed." "Maybe," David said. "But not many people would have had the skills to back it up the way you did." Sarah said you took down 4 guys without breaking a sweat. "They were drunk businessmen, not trained fighters," Jake said with a slight smile. "If they had been actual threats, it would have been a different story." Sarah found herself studying Jake with new eyes. She had known he was capable and confident, but hearing David's reaction made her realize she had been sitting across from someone truly exceptional without understanding it. "What are your plans now that you're out?" David asked. Jake shrugged. "Still figuring that out. Thinking about private security work, maybe some consulting. It's an adjustment, going from having your entire life structured by the military to having to make all your own decisions.
I can imagine, David said.
Though I guess I won't have to imagine much longer.
I've got 8 months left on my enlistment.
You're getting out too?
Sarah asked, surprised.
They had talked about David potentially re-enlisting during their video calls. I've been thinking about it a lot during this deployment, David said, taking her hand. 6 months away from you made me realize what really matters.
I want to come home to you every night, Sarah.
I want us to start a family and build a real life together. Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. They had talked about children before, but David's military obligations had made the timing complicated.
What would you do for work? She asked.
I've got skills that translate to the civilian world.
Sonar technology, electronics, communications.
There are good jobs out there for guys with my background.
Jake nodded approvingly.
Submarine guys are highly sought after in the private sector. Your technical skills and security clearance make you valuable. They talked for another hour about everything and nothing. Sarah watched her husband and Jake develop an easy rapport based on their shared understanding of military life. David told Jake about submarine operations, and Jake shared some sanitized stories about his SEAL training. You know, David said as they were finishing their meal, Sarah mentioned you're looking for work.
Have you considered maritime security?
Companies that protect commercial shipping lanes are always looking for guys with your background.
I hadn't thought about that, Jake admitted. I could make some calls. I know people in that industry.
Good pay, interesting work, and you'd be using your skills to protect innocent people.
Sounds like something that would appeal to you.
Jake looked genuinely interested for the first time since they had started talking about his career prospects. That does sound interesting. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Sarah realized how much her life had changed in just 1 week. She had gone from feeling isolated and vulnerable to having a network of people who genuinely cared about her well-being.
Jake, she said as they walked to the parking lot. I want you to know that meeting you, it changed something for me.
Before that night at the restaurant, I felt like I was just surviving until David came home.
But you reminded me that I'm stronger than I thought I was.
You were always that strong, Jake replied.
You just needed someone to remind you. David put his arm around Sarah's shoulders and extended his other hand to Jake. Brother, I don't know how to thank you properly. You protected my wife when I couldn't be there. That makes you family as far as I'm concerned.
Jake shook David's hand, and Sarah could see he was genuinely moved by the gesture.
Take care of her, Jake said. She's special. I know, David replied. And if you ever need anything at all, you call us. Day or night.
As they said their goodbyes, Sarah realized that what had started as a terrifying encounter with aggressive men had somehow led to one of the most meaningful friendships of her life. Jake had shown up at exactly the right moment, not just to protect her physically, but to remind her of her own strength and worth. Driving home with David beside her for the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in a long time. But she also felt grateful for the unexpected friendship that had sustained her during the final weeks of David's deployment.
You really like him, David observed as they drove. He's a good friend, Sarah said.
He helped me realize I could take care of myself while you were gone.
I'm proud of you for that, David said.
And I'm grateful to him for being there when you needed someone. That night, as Sarah lay in bed next to her husband for the first time in 6 months, she thought about the unpredictable ways life could change. A week ago, she had been dreading David's return, worried that they had grown too far apart to reconnect. Now, she felt more confident in their relationship than ever before. Meeting Jake had reminded her that she was more than just a military wife waiting for her husband to come home. She was a strong, capable woman who could handle whatever challenges life threw at her.
And that realization had made her a better partner for David.
Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. In Jake's case, he had taught her about courage, friendship, and the importance of standing up for what was right. These were lessons she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As David slept peacefully beside her, Sarah smiled, thinking about how she would tell this story someday. It would be a story about a night that started with fear and ended with friendship. A story about discovering strength she didn't know she had, and about the mysterious ways good people appeared in your life exactly when you needed them most. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her new home, preparing dinner for guests who had become like family. Through the window, she could see David and Jake in the backyard, working together to install a new deck. Both men had their shirts off in the late summer heat, and Sarah could see the easy friendship that had developed between them. Life had changed dramatically since that spring day at Norfolk Naval Station. David had completed his military service and found work with a marine engineering firm that specialized in underwater construction projects. Jake had taken David's advice about maritime security and was now working for a company that protected cargo ships from piracy in international waters.
"Honey, how much longer on dinner?"
David called through the screen door.
"Jake's telling me stories that are making me hungry." 20 minutes, Sarah called back.
And, Jake, stop filling my husband's head with your crazy adventure stories. They're not crazy if they actually happened, Jake replied with a grin.
Sarah shook her head with amusement. In the months since David's return, Jake had become a constant presence in their lives.
He had dinner with them at least twice a week, helped David with various home improvement projects, and had become the older brother Sarah never had.
The back door opened and David came inside, followed by Jake.
Both men washed their hands at the kitchen sink while Sarah put the finishing touches on the meal.
"Smells incredible," Jake said, peering over Sarah's shoulder at the pot roast she was preparing.
You know, I'm starting to think you only invite me over so I'll help David with his construction projects.
"That's not true," Sarah said innocently.
I also invite you over because you're the only person who will listen to David's submarine stories without falling asleep.
"Hey!"
David protested.
"My submarine stories are fascinating."
"Sure they are, honey," Sarah said, kissing his cheek. To other submarine guys. As they sat down to dinner, Sarah reflected on how naturally Jake had fit into their lives. He had never overstepped boundaries or made their marriage feel crowded. Instead, his presence had somehow made their relationship stronger. Having a friend who understood military life had helped both Sarah and David navigate the transition to civilian life. "So," Jake said, cutting into his roast beef, "I have some news."
"Good news or bad news?" Sarah asked. "Depends on your perspective. The company offered me a promotion. Team leader position, based out of their Singapore office."
Sarah felt her stomach drop.
"Singapore? As in, the other side of the world, Singapore?" "That's the one." Jake took a sip of his wine. "It's a good opportunity. More money, more responsibility, chance to build my own team." David set down his fork. But it would mean leaving here." "Leaving you guys?" The table fell silent for a moment.
Sarah realized that the thought of Jake moving away felt like losing a family member.
"When would you have to leave?" she asked quietly. "They want an answer by Friday. If I say yes, I'd leave in about 6 weeks."
Sarah looked at David, who was studying his plate with a serious expression.
Finally, David looked up at Jake. "You have to take it," he said.
"David!"
Sarah protested. "No, hear me out," David continued. "Jake, you're one of the most capable people I've ever met.
You're wasted doing routine security runs in the Atlantic. This job sounds like something that would actually challenge you."
Jake nodded slowly. "It would be good work. Real work. The kind of thing that matters."
And, David added with a slight smile, "It's not like it's permanent.
You can always come back."
Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew David was right. Jake was meant for bigger things than the small coastal town where they all lived. Still, the thought of him leaving made her feel unexpectedly emotional.
"Have you made up your mind?" she asked.
"I was hoping to get some advice from my friends," Jake said, looking between Sarah and David.
Sarah took a deep breath.
As much as she didn't want Jake to leave, she knew what she had to say. "You have to follow your heart," she said. The same way you taught me to trust my own strength, you have to trust yourself to know what's right for you. Jake smiled at her words. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. After dinner, they moved to the living room where David and Jake continued their conversation about the job opportunity. Sarah listened as they discussed the technical aspects of maritime security in Southeast Asia, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about how much Jake had changed their lives. Not just through that first dramatic encounter at the restaurant, but through all the quiet moments since then. The way he had helped David readjust to civilian life by sharing his own experiences. The way he had encouraged Sarah to apply for a management position at the restaurant, reminding her that she had leadership qualities she had never recognized. Sarah? Jake's voice brought her back to the present. You're quiet over there. Just thinking, she said. About how different our lives would have been if you hadn't been in that restaurant that night. Someone else would have helped you, Jake said. Maybe. But it wouldn't have been the same. Sarah looked at both men, these two people who had come to mean so much to her. That night changed everything for me. Not just because you protected me, but because you showed me what it looked like to do the right thing without expecting anything in return. David reached over and took Sarah's hand. He did the same thing for me, in a different way. Helped me figure out how to be a good husband instead of just a good sailor. Jake looked uncomfortable with the praise, as he always did. You guys are giving me too much credit. No, Sarah said firmly. We're giving you exactly the right amount of credit. You changed our lives, Jake. For the better. That night, after Jake had gone home, Sarah and David lay in bed talking about their friend's dilemma. He's going to take the job, David said. I can tell. I know. And he should. But I'm going to miss him. Me too. But, Sarah, think about what he's done for us. He helped us become the people we were supposed to be. Maybe now it's time for him to go do the same thing for other people. Sarah considered this. You think that's what he does? Helps people become their best selves? I think some people are just wired that way. They see potential in others and help bring it out. Jake's one of those people. 3 days later, Jake called to tell them he had accepted the position in Singapore. Sarah felt sad but also proud of him for taking the leap. When do you leave? She asked. 4 weeks from Monday. But I want to plan something special for our last weekend together. That last weekend turned out to be a camping trip to the mountains, something Jake had been wanting to do since spring. The three of them spent 2 days hiking, cooking over a campfire, and talking about everything from philosophy to their favorite movies. On the last night of the trip, they sat around the fire as the stars came out overhead. Sarah looked at her husband and her friend, these two men who had shaped her life in such important ways, and felt grateful for the strange path that had brought them all together. I want you both to know something, she said, breaking the comfortable silence. A year ago, I thought I was just a military wife, waiting for my husband to come home so my real life could start. You both taught me that my real life was happening all along. I just had to be brave enough to live it. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the night sky. You were always brave, Sarah. That night at the restaurant, you could have backed down, could have let those men intimidate you. But you didn't. You stood your ground. Because I saw you do it first, Sarah replied. You showed me what courage looked like. David put his arm around Sarah and looked across the fire at Jake. Brother, I'm going to miss having you around. But I'm excited to see what you accomplish in Singapore. I'm going to miss you guys too, Jake said. More than you know. You gave me something I didn't even realize I was looking for. What's that? Sarah asked. A family, Jake said simply. A place to belong. The drive home from their camping trip was bittersweet, filled with promises to stay in touch and plans for future visits. Sarah knew that no matter how far apart they lived, Jake would always be part of their lives. 2 weeks later, they threw Jake a farewell party at the restaurant where everything had started. Tony, the manager, closed the restaurant early so they could have a private celebration with Jake's other friends from town. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing near the table where she had first encountered the four aggressive businessmen. Jake walked over to join her. "Thinking about that night?" he asked. "Yeah. Funny how life works out, isn't it? The worst night turned into the beginning of the best friendship." "Not the worst night," Jake corrected. "The night you discovered how strong you really are." Sarah smiled at the correction. "You always know exactly what to say." "Not always. But I know you, Sarah Martinez. And I know you're going to do amazing things with your life." "We all are," Sarah said, looking around at the gathered friends. "That's what good people do for each other, they help each other become amazing." 3 months later, Sarah received a package from Singapore. Inside was a photo of Jake with his new team, standing on the deck of a cargo ship with the sunset behind them. On the back, he had written, "Found my place. Thanks for helping me remember who I was supposed to be. Love to you both, Jake." Sarah showed the photo to David when he got home from work. They decided to frame it and put it on the mantelpiece next to their wedding photos and other family pictures. "He looks happy," David observed. "He looks like himself," Sarah replied. "Like the person he was always meant to be." That evening, as Sarah and David sat on their completed deck watching the sunset, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a terrifying encounter with aggressive strangers had led to friendship, growth, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be brave. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was feeling afraid and choosing to act anyway. She had learned that strength came not from being invulnerable, but from being willing to ask for help when you needed it. And she had learned that sometimes the most important people in your life showed up when you least expected them. Most importantly, she had learned that everyone had the capacity to be someone's hero, whether that meant stepping in to protect a stranger, supporting a friend through a difficult transition, or simply choosing to see the best in the people around you. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah thought about Jake, somewhere on the other side of the world, probably getting ready to start another day of work that mattered. She thought about David beside her, building a life that honored both his military service and his dreams for the future. And she thought about herself, no longer waiting for her life to begin, but actively creating the story she wanted to tell. The night that had started with fear and ended with friendship had taught them all that the most meaningful connections often came from the most unexpected circumstances. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right," to change everything. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that person became family.